Some things hit you like a grizzly charging downhill. Fast, brutal, and you don't see it coming until it's too late. I stood in my cabin, staring at a photo album I wasn't supposed to find. The thick leather cover, the kind meant to last, hid something rotting inside. My name is Logan Murphy. I'm 55 years old, built like an oak, and about as social as a black bear in winter. I've lived off the grid in the Montana mountains for 10 years now in a cabin I built with my own hands. No power lines. No neighbors. No noise except the wind through the trees and the crackle of a fire. Out here, a man has to be self-sufficient. You hunt, you trap, you chop your own wood. There's no room for weakness, no space for lies. Yet here I was, flipping through pages of them. The photos were careful, deliberate. Not some cheap motel snapshots, but moments meant to mean something. Layla, my wife of 25 years, sitting across from a man I didn't recognize at first. Candlelight dinners, walks along a river, the two of them leaning in close. Some taken here in Montana, others in Seattle, places I'd never been with her. I stopped on one that told me everything, her hands in his, a look on her face I hadn't seen in years. Soft. Wanting. Alive. I closed the album and set it on the old pine table, my fingers pressing into the wood. The last time I felt this kind of quiet rage, I was 22, watching a man break a mare's spirit with a whip. I had broken his nose for it. This was different. This was a kind of anger that settled deep, cold, and patient. The wind rattled the windows. Outside, the forest stretched in every direction, endless, unbothered. I had built this life for us. Left everything behind after our son died, after she couldn't stand the weight of the city anymore. She said she needed the quiet, the space to breathe. So I gave it to her. Turns out she found her air somewhere else. The door creaked open and I heard her boots on the wooden floor. "You're back early," Layla said, setting her purse down on the counter. I turned, keeping my voice steady. Trip was cut short. Snow came in fast. She nodded, peeling off her coat. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back, sharp eyes scanning the room like she could sense something was off. She always had that instinct, the ability to read people, pick them apart. Too bad she thought she was the smartest one in the room. I let the silence stretch. Watched her shift under it. She picked up the tea kettle, filled it like she needed something to do with her hands. "How was the hunt?" "Good." I sat down at the table, fingers drumming against the wood. "You been busy?" She hesitated for half a second, then shrugged. "Same as usual." "Same as usual." I glanced at the album beside me, at the thick, expensive pages. The weight of a double life. She didn't notice it. Or maybe she did and was waiting to see what I'd say. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my face calm. "You ever been to Seattle?" Her hand froze on the kettle handle. Just for a second. Not much, but enough. Then she turned, giving me a practiced, easy smile. "A long time ago." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just wondering." The kettle whistled. She poured the water, moving a little too carefully now. "You should clean up," she said. "You smell like a dead elk." I let her have that one. Let her think the conversation was over. That night, she curled into bed beside me like nothing had changed. But something had, and she knew it. I could feel it in the way she barely breathed, like she was waiting for the next move. I wasn't going to give her that. Not yet. Out here, you don't react fast when you see a wolf near your camp. You watch. You learn its habits. You wait for the right moment. And when the time comes, you don't miss. I woke before dawn, as usual. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough glow to see Layla's shape curled on her side, back turned to me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and stepped into the cold morning air. The ground was hard with frost, the kind that meant winter was settling in for good. I pulled on my boots, shrugged into my jacket, and headed toward the woodpile. Splitting logs had a way of clearing the mind, and mine needed clearing. Each swing of the axe felt like a slow, deliberate thought. I wasn't a man who let emotions take the reins. That's how you got careless. How you made mistakes. I needed a plan, one that didn't leave me looking like some fool caught off guard. By the time the sun crawled over the trees, I had a neat stack of firewood and a decision. First step, secure my ground. I wasn't about to let her or some smug professor pull the rug out from under me. After breakfast, I made a call. "Tanner," came the voice on the other end, rough and tired. "Need a favor," I said. Henry Tanner had been a lawyer long enough to know trouble when he heard it. "What kind of favor?" "Financial. Legal." I glanced toward the cabin, making sure Layla was still inside. "Need to make some changes. Quiet ones. Give me details." I laid it out. Transferring assets, refinancing the cabin, making sure if things went south, I wasn't the one left standing in the cold. "Damn, Logan," Tanner said after a beat. "That bad?" "Worse." He sighed. "All right. I can push it through in a couple days. But if she catches wind, she won't. I hung up and headed into town. The bank was quiet, just a couple of locals talking about the early snows. I kept my head down, got what I needed done, and walked out with the kind of relief that came from knowing you were tightening the net, not getting caught in it. Back home, Layla was on the phone. She hung up quick when I walked in. "Everything all right?" I asked, setting my gloves on the counter. She smiled, too bright. "Just my book club. We're meeting Kalebaro." Layla hadn't been to book club in months. I nodded, playing along. "That right? What book?" She hesitated, just enough. Catcher in the Rye. She hated that book. I poured myself a coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. "You should take the truck," I said. "Roads'll be bad after tonight's snow." She hesitated again, then smiled. "Good idea." She thought I was being thoughtful. I was making sure I knew where she was going. That night, while she slept, I took her phone from the nightstand and scrolled through the messages. There he was, Richard Dane. "Can't wait to see you. Seattle is ours." Logan doesn't suspect a thing, does he? I set the phone back down, careful not to wake her. "Seattle, huh?" I made a note to let her go on that little trip. Let her think she had the upper hand. Sometimes the best way to catch a snake is to let it think it's safe. A cold wind cut through the valley the morning Layla left. She packed light, just a duffel bag and her purse, dressed in the casual but put-together way she always did when she wanted to impress someone. I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, as she hesitated by the truck, then glanced toward the cabin. Maybe she was expecting me to ask questions, to act jealous, to show some kind of fight. I just took a sip of my coffee and nodded toward the road. "Snow's coming in Kalebaro. Drive careful." She hesitated, like she wanted to say something, then forced a smile. "I will." I watched her drive off, taillights fading into the trees. I waited until she was gone, then went back inside, grabbed my jacket and pulled my rifle off the rack. I had work to do. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the back of the Rusty Elk, a bar that smelled like pine sap, old leather, and cheap whiskey. It was early enough that the regulars hadn't rolled in yet. Just me and the bartender, who knew better than to ask questions. A woman walked in, moving like she owned the place. Sarah Whitman, Richard Dane's ex. I recognized her from the old photos I dug up online. A sharp-featured blonde with eyes that didn't miss much. She spotted me right away and slid into the booth across from me. "You're taller than I thought," she said, setting her phone on the table. "You're exactly like I thought," I said back. She smirked, then leaned in. "So, you're the husband. And you're the one he tossed aside when he found a new plaything," I said. Her smile didn't waver. "Looks like we have something in common." I let that sit for a moment. I wasn't one for alliances, but I knew a useful tool when I saw one. She had an axe to grind, and so did I. "I did some digging," she said, pulling up something on her phone. "Your wife isn't the first. Dane has a habit. Picks married women, gets them wrapped around his finger, then moves on once they start talking about leaving their husbands." I studied the screen, emails, messages, even a half-finished letter one woman had written about how he'd convinced her to find herself outside of marriage. Sarah watched me carefully. "You planning on breaking his nose?" "If I was 20 years younger, maybe," I said. "But I like my fights clean." She tapped the phone. "I can help with that." I leaned back. "Why?" She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "Because that bastard ruined my life. He didn't just cheat, he used me. I lost friends, lost work because of the rumors he started. And now he's doing the same thing to your wife, and she's too stupid to see it." "Sounds about right," I said. She slid a piece of paper across the table. "I have something that might interest you." I picked it up. A reservation confirmation. Seattle. A hotel room for 2. "How'd you get this?" I asked. She smiled, sharp and satisfied. "Richard's an arrogant ass. He used the same email account he always does. I still have access." I folded the paper neatly and put it in my pocket. "Appreciate it." She studied me for a second, then leaned in again. "What's your plan, Logan?" I finished my coffee and set the mug down. Gonna let them walk right into their own trap. Sarah's grin widened. I like your style. The night of the block party, the whole town showed up. The Rusty Elk had sponsored the event, which meant cheap beer and a live band playing old country songs. People gathered in clusters, trading stories about the early snows and the latest gossip from town. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The fire pit in the center sent up occasional sparks, crackling like a slow burn. I stood near the back, nursing a beer, letting the night roll forward like nothing was coming. I'd learned long ago that the best traps are the ones where the prey never sees the teeth until it's too late. Sarah moved through the crowd like a ghost, stopping here and there, whispering just enough to set things in motion. Layla's brother, Caleb, was watching from the other side of the fire, his hands shoved into his pockets, jaw tight. He knew what was about to happen. Hell, he wanted it to happen. Then, right on time, Layla and Richard walked in. She looked relaxed, smiling, eyes bright from the weekend. He was just as smug as I expected, tweed coat, that academic air about him, like he thought he was better than the people around him. His hand brushed Layla's back like a man confident in what he had. That wouldn't last long. The band wrapped up a song and the lead singer leaned into the mic, got a special request tonight. One of our regulars sent over some lyrics, hell of a story. Let's give it a listen. I watched as the first chords played. The melody was slow, familiar, something folks could sway to. But the words, those were mine. A man works hard, builds a home with his hands. Gives his love, trusts his woman to stand. But there's always a snake in the high-cut grass. Smilin' while he waits for the right one to pass. The crowd started to pick up on it, heads turning toward Layla and Richard. A few whispers. A few sharp glances. She stiffened beside him. He frowned. The next verse hit harder. A man comes home, finds the truth in a book. Flipped the pages, saw the lives that she took. City boy smiled, thought he played the game right. But a mountain man's patience is sharper than night. Richard's face went pale. Layla took a step back. Then Sarah stepped forward, loud enough for the crowd to hear. You know, Richard, I was wondering how long do you keep up the act before you toss them aside? 6 months? A year? A few gasps. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Layla turned to Richard, confusion twisting into something else. What is she talking about? Sarah crossed her arms. Oh, he didn't tell you? I was you 2 years ago. And before me? Diane Porter. You remember her, don't you, Richard? Caleb stepped forward, his voice thick with disgust. Jesus, Layla? You wrecked your marriage for this guy. Layla's face drained of color. That's not true. Sarah let out a sharp laugh. Oh, sweetheart? Check his email? The weight of it hit Layla all at once. She turned to Richard, but he had already stepped back, hands raised like he wasn't planning on taking responsibility for a damn thing. Layla, don't listen to this. You bastard, she hissed. I took one last sip of my beer and set the bottle down on a nearby table. You sure know how to pick 'em, Layla. She turned toward me then, fury and panic battling in her expression. You did this. I met her eyes, calm and steady. No. You did this. The whispers had turned into full conversations now. People were shaking their heads, muttering. A few of Richard's university colleagues had already started stepping away, like they didn't want to be caught in the fallout. Layla looked around, realizing for the first time that there was no escape from this. Her reputation, her affair, it wasn't a secret anymore. Richard, sensing the heat, turned and started toward the exit. Sarah wasn't done with him yet. You know that grant you applied for, Richard? She smiled. I made sure the university got a little packet about your extracurricular activities. Seems they don't take kindly to professors sleeping with married women. Especially not when there's a pattern. He stopped in his tracks. You didn't. Oh, I did. His hands curled into fists, but there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Instead, he turned to Layla, his voice cold now. I should have known better than to get involved with someone so predictable. Layla recoiled like she'd been slapped. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked away. Let her stand there in the wreckage of her choices. The snow came heavy that night, burying the town under a thick, quiet blanket. By morning, the roads were half frozen, the kind of ice that could send a man sliding into a ditch if he wasn't careful. I had nowhere to be, no reason to leave the cabin, but I took the truck out anyway. Needed the drive. Needed the air. The Rusty Elk was quieter than usual, the aftermath of the block party still hanging in the air. Small towns didn't forget things like that. By now, Layla's name had been dragged through every morning coffee conversation. Richard was likely packing his bags, and Sarah was probably somewhere celebrating her little victory. I wasn't in the mood for celebrating. I just wanted things squared away. Tanner was already at a corner table, a stack of papers in front of him. He barely glanced up when I sat down. It's done, he said, pushing the top page toward me. Divorce papers. Properties in your name, assets are locked down. She gets nothing. I flipped through the pages, reading each line slow. Tanner was thorough. Layla had no claim to the cabin, no stake in my accounts, no leg to stand on. I could already imagine the moment she realized it. I signed my name at the bot. Caleb. She see these yet? Tanner smirked. Dropped them off this morning. Didn't take it well. I didn't ask for details. I could picture it just fine. The woman who thought she had choices, watching them vanish one by one. She gonna fight it? I asked. Wouldn't matter if she did, Tanner said. But no, I don't think she will. She's got other problems now. That much was true. Richard had gone up in flames faster than I expected. By noon, I heard he'd been placed on administrative leave. By evening, there were rumors about other women, some coming forward, some just whispering. Didn't take long for a man like that to fall once people knew where to push. I finished my coffee and stood. Appreciate it, Tanner. He nodded, gathering his papers. Take care, Logan. The drive home was slower, the snow thick on the winding roads. I didn't mind. The cabin was waiting, solid and quiet, untouched by any of this. When I pulled up, something moved near the tree lean. Small, bundled in a thin coat, dark hair barely visible under a hood. A kid. I stepped out, boots crunching in the snow. The boy looked up, wide-eyed, like a deer caught too close to the road. Couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13. What the hell are you doing out here? I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. Got lost? I looked him over. Too clean to be a runaway. Too thin for someone who ate regular meals. His hands were red from the cold, no gloves. I sighed, nodding toward the cabin. Come on. You'll freeze out here. He hesitated again, then followed. I wasn't much for company, but I knew what it was to be left out in the cold. Inside, the fire had burned low, but the cabin was warm enough. The boy stood near the door, shifting from foot to foot, his breath still fogging in the cold air. I grabbed a blanket from the chair and tossed it his way. He caught it, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to use it. Sit, I said, nodding toward the couch. He did, slow and careful, like a deer testing ice. I put the kettle on, then leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Name? Nathan, he said, voice small but steady. I nodded. Where you from? He didn't answer right away. Just looked at his hands, rubbing them together. Around. That told me enough. Folks know you're out here? I asked. His jaw tightened. No. That told me even more. The kettle whistled. I poured 2 cups, slid one across the table. He wrapped his fingers around it, soaking up the heat. Didn't drink, just held it. You hungry? I asked. He nodded, and I grabbed some leftover stew, reheating it on the stove. The kid ate fast, like someone who wasn't sure when the next meal was coming. I let him finish before I said anything else. You got a place to go? He shrugged. Not really. I sighed, ran a hand through my beard. I wasn't in the business of taking in strays. But I wasn't about to send a kid back out into the snow with nothing but a thin coat and no plan. Got work that needs doing around here, I said. You stay, you help. His head lifted, eyes wary but interested. Like what? I nodded toward the woodpile outside. Chopping. Stacking. Keeping the fire going. You know how to trap. He shook his head. I took a sip of my coffee. You'll learn. The wariness in his eyes shifted, something closer to hope settling in its place. That night, as the fire crackled low, I sat in my chair, watching the snow pile up outside. Nathan had curled up under the blanket on the couch, already asleep. The cabin felt different. Lighter. Like the weight of everything that had happened wasn't pressing so damn hard anymore. Betrayal had come and gone, but I was still here. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so empty. The lake was calm that morning, the kind of stillness that only came when the wind had nowhere to be. I stood at the edge of the dock, looking out at the water, feeling the weight of the rifle slung across my back. Nathan was a few yards behind me, checking the traps we'd set along the shoreline. The kid had taken to the work fast. He wasn't soft, just untested. Life had thrown him into the deep end, but he hadn't sunk yet. That was something. Anything? I called over my shoulder. One muskrat, one empty, he answered, pulling a half-frozen mess of fur from the trap. Gonna reset it. I nodded, watching as he worked. The past few months had changed things. Nathan had settled in, proving useful enough to keep around. He didn't talk much about where he came from, and I didn't push. Some things a man had to figure out on his own. The town had moved on, as towns do. Layla left not long after the divorce was finalized, tail tucked between her legs. I heard she tried to stay, but she couldn't go anywhere without feeling the weight of what she'd done. Small-town shame had a way of sticking. Last I heard, she was in Spokane, working some job beneath her. Richard never got a chance to leave on his own terms. The university canned him, and when Sarah's little package of information spread, his name was worth less than nothing. I saw him once after that, sitting in the back of a bus at the station, shoulders hunched, a duffel bag between his feet. He didn't look up when I walked by. Didn't have to. He knew. Sarah had moved on too, though not before making sure Richard's downfall was permanent. She sent me a message a while back, short and to the point. "Hope you're doing all right, Mountain Man. We made a good team." I never answered. Some things didn't need a reply. Nathan finished resetting the trap and wiped his hands on his coat. "You think we'll get another storm before the season's done?" "Maybe," I said. "Better to be ready for it." He nodded, looking out at the water. "You ever get tired of all this?" I thought about that. About the years I'd spent up here, the life I'd built with my own hands, the quiet that had once felt like the only thing keeping me sane. I looked at the boy beside me, the fire still left in him, the way he was learning to survive. "No," I said finally. "Not once." He nodded again, like he understood. Maybe he did. The wind picked up just a little, sending ripples across the water. I took a deep breath, let it settle in my chest. The past was done. The road ahead was clear. And I had no intention of looking back.